Good morning, everybody. It's both a pleasure and a sadness to talk about Eric. Uh, we've slightly changed our title. It's now 1976 to 1986, because I checked in my field notebooks from Minnesota, actually when I first met Eric, which was 1976. So what I'm going to talk about is how we got to know each other, uh, and then the time in Cambridge, and then a few things post the Cambridge era. So Hilary and I were both, and this is just background history, were both postdocs at the Limnological Research Center at the University of Minnesota, which in those days was housed on the second floor of this rather ugly building at Pillsbury Hall. And we were working there with Herb Bright and closely with Ed Cushing. And then after our year there, I returned to be a sort of postdoc for a month every year for 12 years to do pollen counting, have discussions, writing, and of course, survive Minnesota winter fieldwork. And this is when in 1976, I met a young PhD student of Ed's called Eric Grimm. And inevitably, as always happened in March or April, one ended up coring, in this case at Woodsfield Lake, which was one of Eric's PhD sites. And here you see, so we lug all the equipment in on a hand toboggan and then start coring. One spring in 1981, Eric and I, rather inspired by the work of Sven Andersen in Denmark, went looking for small hollows near Woodsfield Lake to try and get local pollen records, but we weren't very successful in finding such sites. So Eric in 1981 submitted his PhD thesis, an ecological and paleoecological study of the Big Woods region of Minnesota. And this led to two major publications, one in the New Phytologist and one in Ecological Monographs. Now, the Big Woods are an area, here is Minnesota, Minneapolis and so on, which has sadly been in the news rather a lot recently as about here. The Big Woods is an area of mesic deciduous forest of ulmus, tilia, ostraya, acer saccharum, and it's adjacent to prairie, woodland, and patches shown here in dark of open Quercus populus woodland. And ecologists for a long time thought it was really a shifting mosaic of transitional stages in response to fire. So Eric tested that hypothesis by doing detailed pollen at two sites, Woodsfield Lake, which is in the northeastern part of the Big Woods, and French Lake, which is right at the western edge. And what he showed, the Woodsfield Lake, 6,000 years, was that the mesic forest species like ostraya, ulmus, tilia, acer all came in and about very much towards the top. Here is the ambrosia rise, which signifies European settlement. So the Woodsfield Lake record 6,000 years, French Lake 4,000. So both sequences showed that this Quercus woodland began to invade prairie at Woodsfield Lake about 5,000 years ago and at French Lake about 2,400. And topography and water bodies controlled in a very intricate way the fire frequency and hence where woodland invaded prairie. Ulmus, ostraya, tilia, acer saccharum, the Big Woods rapidly expanded and became dominant about 300 years ago in response to reduced fire frequency caused by increased precipitation. So Eric developed a conceptual model. Here is time, this is mean annual precipitation, that below a certain value, you could only get prairie. And any transition, either from woodland or prairie prior to that, always led to prairie. Between these two levels of precipitation, you could have woodland or prairie forming effectively multiple stable states. And above a certain precipitation level, you would only have woodland. And if there had been prairie there, it reverted to woodland. So this was one of the first demonstrations of the concepts of inertia and threshold that Alan Smith had introduced in 1965, which now tend to get called resilience and tipping points or alternative stable states. And like all great papers over 30 years ago, with 39 pages, it's rather rarely read or cited. So in 1981-82, and in fact, I realized it was 40 years next month in May that Eric and Jane, his wife, Eric was a postdoc fellow with us in the botany school, as it was then called, in the University of Cambridge, and with very good company, Henry Lamb, Keith Bennett, Paul Kerslake, Sylvia Pegler, Pete Coxon, Brian and Jackie Huntley. And during his year, he did a huge amount of fieldwork helping people in Spain, Italy, Scotland, as here, Morocco and Ireland. And what we were doing here, we were working this beautiful loch in northwest Scotland, Loch Marie, with the mountain Sleop behind, and using islands in the middle of this loch to then test hypotheses about drivers of change in the vegetation. Other boating activities included punting. That's a sort of Oxford-Cambridge activity on the River Cam, here with Rhea Wright, Herb's wife. Jane Allard had a go, and Henry Lamb was the master punter. This is going under the mathematical bridge at Queen's and the Bridge of Sighs at St. John's. Jane was a very talented artist, and Hilary enjoyed many painting sessions with her. And Jane also designed wonderful posters for Academy of Ancient Music concerts that we were organizing in Cambridge. Eric prepared papers from his thesis and developed, whilst he was in Cambridge, a strong interest in numerical analysis and data display, and led to the proto-software, Tilia software. And in fact, in the early versions, there was even a allowance for reading in data sets in Cambridge format. So sadly, in May 1982, we said farewells to them. Hilary, as she always does, made a wonderful cake. Eric and Jane come back soon with pollen grain. So at that stage, Tilia wasn't figuring as a key grain, and Jane's art easel and paints. Well, then Eric was now back in Minnesota, working in the Limnological Research Center, and he and his close friend, George Jacobson, published this really major paper, a numerical analysis of Holocene forest and prairie vegetation in central Minnesota. And this was a site called Billy's Lake, and this, I think, is probably the first published pollen diagram that was drawn by Proto-Tilia, and it covers the last 11,000 radiocarbon years. What they did was to do a combined numerical analysis of 77 fossil samples at Billy's Lake and 105 pre-settlement, just before Europeans settled in Minnesota, by doing a cluster analysis and also a detrended correspondence analysis. They used the newly developed method by my colleague Alan Gordon called Barrier, which allows for transitional samples in the subdivision, the partitioning of the diagram. And this is close to real life vegetation dynamics. And he did an ordination by DCA, which was very new at that stage. Mark Hill, who was also in Cambridge, had developed the technique. And it was a really excellent choice because equal distances in the ordination equal ecological, or in this case, palnological distance. And we now know that the distance metric implicit in DCA is theoretically the optimal metric for percentage data containing many zero values. So they estimated, George and Eric estimated the rate of palnological change or turnover in turnover units for every 100 years at Billy's Lake. And that was one of the first quantitative estimates of rates of change. So we now move on from 1986 to this 1994, when the American Quaternary Association had its annual meeting in Minnesota, and the late Jeff Seltzer, who you can see here, had the brilliant idea of getting all the LRC past and present members together in chronological order. So you have Herb, Ed Cushing, Jock McAndrews, Dick Baker, Barbara Hanson, Bill Watts, then Tom Shea, there's Eric, Henry Lamb, who's talking a bit later, George Jacobson, who's talking in the American session, Paul Glazer, Sherry Fritz, who is talking in the American session, Jim Almendinger, Dan Engstrom, and Kathy Whitlock. Their more recent well-known paleoecologists include Dirk Verschoon here, who was then doing his PhD, and Brian Cumming at Queens, Ontario. And then in 2006, Eric's great mentor, Ed Cushing, a person of enormous intellect, and I learned so very, very much from Ed, not only about the methodology, but the philosophy of paleoecology. When Ed retired, then George Jacobson, Eric, and Herb, they then had a retirement walk for Ed in the Big Woods, which had always been an area that Ed was particularly interested in. Well, what can one say about Eric's personal attributes? Well, obviously, Jane and Eric were very close, and their daughter Maria. And after Tilia came into being, we used to joke when we sent them Christmas cards to suggest that their second child was called Tilia. Eric really was so devoted, not only to Maria, but to Tilia. So what can one say, trying to sum him up? Well, he was probably one of the most totally non-competitive scientists I've ever known. Very generous, highly original, super kind, extremely meticulous, amongst all these other personal attributes. Eric really was one of the most remarkable scientists I've had the pleasure to work with and to know. So Hilary and I greatly miss Eric. We look back at the great times that we had together, and send our very best wishes to Jane and to Maria. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It was a fantastic and emotional presentation, really. And I really liked the way you were presenting in the end who was Eric in personal terms, because I think I could agree with every single thing you said. So we are going to move now to the next speaker. I'm going to share